There is no ethical consumption under capitalism. You criticize society, yet you participate in it. We've seen these slogans and memes being passed around. But let's be honest with ourselves, there are degrees to complicity or entanglement with the system. There are layers to this, and I just wanted to talk about it. Not to create moral casts or anything, but to make plain how different actions contribute to the reproduction of systems of domination. Now, on the first level, the least amount of complicity I think you can have is probably going off grid completely, growing your food sustainably, rewilding your environment, generating your own power, basically making everything you need for yourself and avoiding institutions entirely. But even then, you might still be implicated in small ways if, for whatever reason, you have to use state currency, or if you don't make literally everything yourself, like your tools, or if you have legal ownership of the land you're on. But what I'm getting at this level is that you have a minimum dependence on the system, and you're doing as little as you can to reproduce the system. Obviously, I'm not on this level, and if you're watching this video, you're probably not either. But if you were, I still have a word of advice, which is that rather than further extricating yourself from the system, you might be better served actively resisting it through collective action. 1,000 isolated homesteads are not going to threaten the system they're escaping from. But an interconnected web of such projects actually pose a meaningful threat. They can actually form the support or the launchpad for more confrontational action and counter-economic development. The next layer of complicity is just the basic cooperation with the status quo. You're not going out of your way to avoid them or to implicate yourself too heavily, but you have to put food on the table and try to stay out of trouble. So you're paying rent, taxes, fees, fines, bills, the stuff you kind of have no choice but to do to participate in society, even though it feeds into socially and environmentally harmful institutions and infrastructure. And in the case of Americans in particular, literally paying taxes into the foremost imperial hegemon with its wars and genocides. Your ecological footprint at this level is probably also a net negative, and you're buying stuff that depends on a global chain of exploitation at every stop. And you're mostly just keeping your head down, adhering to authority and the rules and laws that govern society. So at this level, it's direct financial support to the system and just any basic labor and social contribution, greasing the wheels of commerce and systemic inertia, and chipping away at the biosphere itself. Unfortunately, I and most of us on Earth are involuntarily on this layer of basic reproduction of the system. You might mitigate this layer of complicity by various collective approaches to non-cooperation, such as the rent strike, tax strike, labor strike, boycotts, but of course those are easier said than done. And you might also try on an individual level to shorten your supply chains where possible to minimize the ecological impact. But individual action is marginal, of course. Systemic change is what's needed. The third layer of complicity would be betrayals of collective resistance efforts that weaken solidarity and legitimize exploitation. This is where I think you start to carry a greater deal of personal responsibility because there were likely other options, but for the sake of your own convenience and comfort, or because of your ignorance, you went ahead and crossed a picket line, ignored a boycott, maybe didn't take certain health precautions, that kind of thing. Even on this layer, I would say there are levels to it, of course. There's the more passive non-participation of not getting involved in a boycott. I'm guilty of this by not participating in the World Cup boycott to the fullest extent. I mean, FIFA hasn't seen any of my money, but I am still watching the game by other means. But on another level, there's the more active undermining of collective resistance efforts, like crossing a picket line or actively discouraging collective action. And people are going to have different perspectives on where hard lines should be drawn. For some people, anything less than using Linux might be a betrayal. But sad to say, I'm still on Windows. Or I might consciously try to avoid Amazon and Google wherever I can, but they control most of the internet these days. My livelihood is, as you can see, tied to Google, so you have to be realistic about your expectations of people. On the other hand, it's comparatively easy to just not go to Starbucks or McDonald's or refuse to buy Puma products or HP devices, for example. Though it would just be wasteful to throw away the Puma products or HP devices that you already own. On this level, I think it's important to hold a measure of grace and take things in context before getting all gung-ho about going after somebody. Maybe they didn't know there was a boycott. There are probably boycotts I'm not even aware of that I'm unknowingly crossing. Some companies are almost impossible to boycott. Like, Nestle kind of runs the world. I think strike picket lines are more obvious though. They're usually temporary and usually quite visible. So I would say you bear greater personal responsibility for crossing those. Also, I think there is room to disagree with the strategic efficacy of certain attempted collective pressure campaigns, even if you agree with the spirit of them. I don't practice a vegan lifestyle, which for some probably makes me a traitor. Again, different perspectives on things. But I do try to limit my consumption of animal products where possible, with the knowledge that the source of those products is, in most cases, animal suffering. Though to be fair, most of the products we consume are the result of human and non-human animal suffering anyway. So you do what you can. You might mitigate this layer of complicity by making a genuine effort to stay informed about collective campaigns, respecting picket lines and boycotts when reasonably possible, and generally erring on the side of solidarity when your individual convenience conflicts with a collective struggle. You don't need to agree with every campaign, but you should at least seriously consider whether your actions are helping or undermining people trying to resist exploitation. The fourth layer of complicity may be your role in various hierarchies and the things you do to reinforce them. By hierarchies, I'm referring specifically to the institutionalization of differences between people into superior and subordinate social roles, through which comes domination and exploitation. And in this layer, you're passively or actively reproducing patriarchy, gerontocracy, the economic class system, and so on. In the subordinate position, you may be treating bosses, politicians, police, clergy, men, or elders as inherently entitled to obedience. Or in the superior position, you may be using that position to dominate others, overriding their autonomy because of gender, disability, or social status. Reproducing authoritarian norms in your family, workplace, organization, or social movement. Basically, participating in the normalization and perpetuation of hierarchy on the micro scale and the macro scale through your actions. You might mitigate this layer of complicity by internally deconstructing the beliefs and attitudes which reinforce these systems, and by externally resisting the structures which reinforce these systems through various acts of confrontation and non-cooperation. This is where it gets really serious. On the fifth layer of complicity, you're some kind of propagandist for the status quo, spreading state or corporate narratives, defending imperialist wars, pushing nationalist or capitalist mythologies to sustain the legitimacy of the system and counteract dissent. You may not be carrying a gun for our capitalist overlords, but you're fighting for them on the battlefield of ideas, reinforcing ridiculous ideas like the sanctity of borders, or that poverty is deserved, or that alternatives are impossible, or capitalism is natural, or imperial wars are justified. Essentially lecturing people on why suffering is necessary and resistance is unrealistic. Again, of course, there are levels to this. Journalists, teachers, influencers, religious leaders, academics, politicians, ordinary citizens, all can participate in this reproduction of ideas that makes domination appear normal, necessary, inevitable, or desirable. But of course, this is perpetuated to different extents on a person-to-person basis. And some people in these roles actively counteract that kind of messaging. So don't take this as me saying that if you're a teacher, you're automatically on the level of a right-wing propagandist by default. That's not what I'm saying. At this layer of complicity, you need to deconstruct the narratives you repeat, seek out perspectives from those harmed by existing institutions, correct misinformation where you encounter it, and lend your voice to counteract the tide of propaganda. On the sixth layer of complicity, you're deliberately choosing roles that directly sustain and uphold the system. Hands-on participation in domination by serving in the military, police, paramilitary forces, prison guards, border agents, intelligence operatives, strikebreakers, judges, prosecutors, high-level state bureaucrats, the kind of positions that actively enforce imperialism, colonialism, and domestic repression. The kind of positions that defend corporate and state efforts to devastate the environment. And how much more really needs to be said here? Of course, I think if you're on this level, you know what you're doing. Of course, not every military is on the same level of complicity in upholding the global system. I would count the US military as far more active upholders of global suffering than, say, the Trinidadian military. But at this level of complicity, where you're a foot soldier for capital and government, you should leave such institutions, especially if you're part of the American military. I mean, if your job is to cage people, to suppress dissent, to wage war, the most obvious thing is to refuse. But aside from leaving, or perhaps on your way out, other ways of mitigating this layer of complicity would be sabotaging the machinery of domination, leaking information, refusing orders, and otherwise obstructing the flow of the machinery. Obviously, such actions come at great personal risk, but if you're a police officer, or soldier, or prison guard, you've already taken great personal risk signing up for those jobs. At least take some risk to help other people. But if I'm being honest, I doubt that any police officers or prison guards are watching my videos anyway. For the final layer of complicity, level 7, this should be obvious. These are the architects of the system itself. The deepest complicity. Occupying roles that directly manage or profit from exploitation. Politicians, corporate executives, bankers, landlords, wardens, chiefs, capitalists, those who construct, expand, and manage the machinery of state and capital. Now, obviously, an individual landlord didn't invent landlordism. An individual CEO didn't invent capitalism. A small business owner and the CEO of a multinational corporation are going to be on different layers of complicity. So I would suggest modified approaches to specific cases because, again, there are levels to this. But at this layer, you're occupying positions of significant control over capital relative to others and materially benefiting from the continuation of the system, placing your material interests against those of us who wish to overturn this system. Historically, there have been class traitors here and there, people who choose to provide their property and resources toward revolutionary ends, but these are few and far between. Still, as an effort at mitigation, I'd encourage anyone with such capital who are sympathetic to the struggle to share those resources to support our efforts in getting free. And that's it. I just wanted to try my hand at the 7 layers trend with an idea I thought about some time ago. We're obviously not all equally complicit. There's a difference between buying groceries in a capitalist economy, crossing a picket line, beating protesters, and profiting from exploitation. But we are all implicated in different ways, and I wanted to try and sketch it out. I know it's an imperfect setup, and maybe you disagree with how I'd arrange things or add to the layers of complicity, but let me know what you think, and how you feel we could resist the state of affairs through individual and collective action, as well as what you're doing to make a difference. Leave a comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Peace.